The rain fell softly against the windows of a palace that no longer knew peace. Somewhere in those echoing halls, a girl once laughed, a princess born to a kingdom of ambition, prophecy, and guilt. Her name was Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish queen who had crossed oceans and wars to become the bride of Henry VIII. That union had begun as the golden hope of Europe, a young king and queen, brilliant, learned, pious, united by faith and crowned by destiny. Yet destiny in Tudor England was never merciful. The cradle that held the child also carried the weight of a dynasty forever haunted by its own hunger for power. The Tudor bloodline was not a lineage. It was a wound that refused to close. Henry VIII's reign began with the fire of youth and ended soaked in the ashes of 6 wives. 2 executed, 1 forgotten, and all sacrificed to the dream of a male heir. But the story that truly outlived him was not written in the lives of his sons. It was carved into the hearts of his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, 2 sisters who would rule the same kingdom, inherit the same curse, and wear the same crown that destroyed their mother. Mary came first, born in Greenwich in the year 1516. She was the only surviving child of Catherine of Aragon, a queen moulded from iron and faith, daughter of Isabella of Castile, the warrior who had united Spain beneath the cross. Catherine taught her child in the language of Latin, prayer, and endurance. Mary learned to kneel before God, long before she learned to walk. She grew up in a world where duty was divine, and her father's smile was sunlight. She did not yet know that the same man who kissed her forehead in tenderness would one day sign the letters that erased her name from history. Then came the silence of disappointment. Catherine turned 40, and no son was born. The court whispered, the priests debated, and Henry's heart, restless as a storm, turned away. When Anne Boleyn entered his life, she was not merely a woman, she was a spark that set faith itself on fire. To marry her, Henry broke with the Church of Rome, tore the crown from the Pope's hands, and declared himself head of the Church of England. What began as passion became blasphemy, and what he called love became war. Mary, now a young woman, watched her mother fall from grace, and her father's affection turn to cruelty. She was forbidden to see Catherine, banished from the court, and forced to acknowledge that she was no longer legitimate, that her mother had never been queen, and that she herself was nothing. It was the first betrayal that shaped her soul. When Catherine died in her exile, Henry refused Mary even the right to attend the funeral. Alone, the princess knelt and whispered a prayer over an empty room, her tears falling on cold stone. From that day forward, the seed of bitterness took root in her heart, a faith hardened by pain, a devotion sharpened into vengeance. Yet the crown did not rest quietly on Henry's new bride. Anne Boleyn's triumph was brief. In September 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, not the son Henry had been promised by prophecy. The same courtiers who once praised her now murmured curses under their breath. Henry's passion cooled, his anger returned, and the circle of destruction began again. When Anne was accused of adultery and treason, Mary, the daughter she had replaced, heard the tolling of the tower bells with a strange silence. The woman for whom her mother had been discarded now lay headless on the scaffold, and in that moment, Mary learned that God's justice, even when cruel, could be swift. Elizabeth, the orphaned child of a fallen queen, grew up in the shadows of her father's guilt. Her mother's name was a curse, her existence a reminder, yet she learned quickly, carefully, and with a mind sharper than any sword at court. She watched her father's wives come and go, each bearing the same fate to please, to fail, to fall. Mary, older and wounded, carried her mother's rosary. Elizabeth, younger and watchful, carried her father's eyes. They were two halves of the same scar, one carved by faith, the other by survival. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, he left behind not a dynasty, but a battlefield. His son, Edward VI, still a boy, inherited a crown too heavy for his hands. His death a few years later would plunge England into chaos. But before that storm, the sisters had already begun their silent war. The elder believed she was chosen by God to restore the true faith. The younger believed she was chosen by fate to save the realm from its own madness. Their bond was written in blood, and every prayer, every glance, every whisper between them carried the ghost of their father's cruelty. Mary's reign would be drenched in the smoke of martyrdom, her name forever branded as Bloody Mary. But to her, each pyre that rose over London was a confession of loyalty to heaven, a desperate attempt to cleanse the world of her father's sins. Elizabeth would learn from those flames. When her turn came, she would wield mercy like a mask, charm like a blade, and power like an art form. She would never marry, never kneel, and never share her throne. The daughter of Anne Boleyn would become the Virgin Queen, the sovereign of illusion, the monarch of endurance. Yet behind the glory of Elizabeth's reign lay the bones of her sister's suffering. Without Mary's fall, there could be no Elizabethan rise. Without the fire, there could be no light. They were not opposites, they were reflections. Two daughters of the same man, carrying the burden of his vanity, his lust, and his longing for immortality. Each believed she was saving England. Each, in her own way, destroyed it to rebuild it anew. And when the years passed, when the crowns had turned to dust and the fires to legend, both sisters would sleep beneath the same stone in Westminster Abbey, side by side, as if time itself could not separate what blood and destiny had already entwined. Mary, the queen who burned for faith. Elizabeth, the queen who reigned for glory. The world would remember one as the tyrant and the other as the savior. But both were merely daughters of a man who could never love without breaking what he touched. So when you hear the name Tudor, do not think of grandeur or triumph. Think of a candle flickering in a storm, of a crown heavy with guilt, of two women who turned their father's sins into the foundation of an empire. Think of the silence between their prayers, the echo of their footsteps in the same lonely palace, the reflection of firelight on the same golden crown. That is where their story begins, in the breathless stillness of power, where love and ruin wear the same face. Because before England found glory, it drowned in the tears of two daughters. And in the echoes of those tears, history learned that even in a kingdom built by kings, it was two women who carried the flame, one of fire, one of light, both born of blood. Mary's story began in the hush of cathedral bells and the scent of incense, in a chamber where her mother, Catherine of Aragon, knelt more often than she slept. The walls of Greenwich Palace carried the rhythm of Latin prayers, the rustle of silk gowns, and the low hum of destiny. Catherine's eyes, dark and unwavering, studied her newborn daughter with both pride and sorrow. She had come from Spain, the land of crusaders and saints, a queen who believed that faith could command the will of heaven. Her daughter, she whispered, would be no less than a miracle, born in defiance of despair. For years, she had lost child after child, each one buried in silence before the court could even celebrate. Mary was the one who survived. the proof that the womb of the Queen was not cursed, that God had not turned away from the Tudors. Henry VIII, then still a young monarch full of laughter and restless confidence, loved the child with a father's easy joy. He would lift her in his arms, call her his little pearl, his comfort, his pride. When she spoke her first words, courtiers smiled as if England itself had taken a breath of relief. But affection in the court of Henry was as fragile as glass. It shimmered for a moment, then shattered without warning. For though he adored his daughter, he adored his own image even more, and the absence of a son began to fester in him like a sickness. Mary grew under the watchful eyes of scholars and nuns, her mind shaped by devotion, her hands trained in the arts of the court. She could read and write Latin before she was 10, could play the virginals with grace, could recite psalms from memory. She was taught to believe that wisdom was holy and obedience divine. Catherine made sure that her daughter's soul was fortified with the same unyielding discipline that had guided generations of Spanish queens. Your body, her mother would say, may one day be ruled by a king, but your conscience must answer only to God. In those early years, Mary's world was gilded and secure. She dined beneath ceilings painted with angels, rode through meadows with her father's banners fluttering above her, and watched the courtiers bow as if the sun itself had entered the room when she appeared. Yet even as she smiled, the storm was already gathering. In London, whispers travelled faster than prayers. The Queen was aging. The Queen was barren. The Queen's time was ending. Henry's disappointment hardened into something more dangerous than grief-resentment. He began to see divine judgment in his misfortune, to believe that his marriage was cursed because Catherine had once been wed to his brother, Arthur. The Bible, he claimed, forbade such a union, and his heart seized upon that verse like a lifeline. His need for absolution disguised itself as love for another woman. Anne Boleyn was clever, magnetic, impossible to ignore. She refused to be his mistress, and that refusal became a crown he could not resist chasing. As Henry's obsession grew, Mary's childhood began to fracture. Invitations to court became rarer. The letters from her father cooled, each one more formal, less affectionate. When she was 17, she was sent to Ludlow to act as the Princess of Wales, a title of honour that became, in truth, an exile cloaked in ceremony. There, she ruled in her father's name, signing decrees, learning the rhythm of command, unaware that, soon, even this borrowed authority would be stripped away. At Ludlow, she read by candlelight, studied the art of statecraft, and dreamed of her father's approval. She prayed that another child would be born a brother who would secure the dynasty and free her from the silent competition that seemed to hover over every Tudor daughter. But the prayers went unanswered, and by the time Mary returned to London, Anne Boleyn had replaced her mother in the king's heart. The banners that once bore Catherine's coat of arms had been torn down, the Queen's servant dismissed, the chapel stripped of its symbols of Rome. Mary's mother was commanded to accept the annulment of her marriage. She refused. She would not confess to sin where there had been love, nor would she deny her daughter's legitimacy. The Pope himself delayed his judgment, unwilling to anger the Spanish crown. But time moved slower for Catherine than for the king. She was banished to remote castles, her possessions seized, her letters censored. For Mary, the separation was a wound that never healed. She wrote letters that went unanswered, begged to see her mother's face, was denied even that final mercy. Henry decreed that they could meet only if both declared support for the annulment. Neither would bend. Mother and daughter lived out their grief in parallel prisons, one of stone, one of silence. By the time news came that Catherine was dying, Mary had been stripped of everything. Her title was gone, her household reduced, her servants forced to call her lady instead of princess. She was no longer heir to England, but an embarrassment the crown preferred to forget. When her mother's death reached her in January of 1536, she collapsed. She begged to attend the funeral, but Henry refused. He ordered that she remain confined, forbidden to mourn publicly, as the court celebrated Catherine's passing with feasts and tournaments. Mary knelt alone in her chamber, her hands clasped until her knuckles turned white. She whispered the rosary in Spanish, every word a blade drawn across her heart. In that moment, something inside her hardened. Her faith, once gentle and luminous, became iron. She began to believe that her suffering was not punishment, but calling, that she was chosen to endure humiliation as Christ endured the cross. The child who had been raised to smile became the woman who would one day burn men for heresy. The princess who once begged for her father's affection became the queen who would demand the obedience of a nation. Henry remarried again and again, as if trying to outpace the ghosts he had created. But for Mary, the court was no longer home. It was a labyrinth of betrayals. She lived quietly, watching her father's wives fall like petals from a poisoned flower. And when her half-sister Elizabeth was born, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the living proof of her mother's displacement, Mary learned the cruelest lesson of all, that innocence is no shield in the house of Tudor. The infant who should have been her rival was, in truth, her mirror, another pawn in their father's unending game with destiny. Years later, when Anne Boleyn's body was carried from the Tower and the king took yet another wife, Jane Seymour, Mary saw the pattern clearly. The Tudor throne was built not on love, but on sacrifice. To be born of that blood was to live under the shadow of execution, whether by sword or by sorrow. Yet even as the years turned and power shifted, Mary never forgot the promises whispered to her as a child, that she was meant for greatness, that God would not forsake her. Beneath the fear and the silence, she carried an ember that refused to die. It was that same ember that would one day ignite a kingdom. For now, though, she remained a ghost in her father's halls, a daughter stripped of her name, wandering the corridors of memory, where the scent of her mother's prayers still lingered. The tapestries had changed. The portraits had new faces, but the cold draft of loss followed her everywhere. And somewhere deep within, she knew the truth that history would later confirm, that the battle for England's soul had already begun. Not in the council chambers or on the fields of war, but in the quiet heart of a young woman who had learned that love, in her father's world, was the most dangerous sin of all. The child born to unite kingdoms had become the woman destined to divide them. And as night fell over the palace that had once been her nursery, Mary Tudor whispered the same words her mother had once spoken before the crucifix, that all crowns are made of thorns, and every heir must bleed before they shine. The palace walls seemed to whisper that something sacred had broken. Once, the air of England had been filled with the calm rhythm of church bells, the murmured Latin of prayers, the golden promise that God and King were one. But by the time Mary reached her womanhood, those bells tolled for something else, not for worship, but for war. Her father's heart, once bound to the Church of Rome, now burned with a new, consuming faith himself. The divorce of heaven and hell did not begin with thunder. It began with a whisper, the whisper of temptation, the rustle of silk, the sound of Anne Boleyn's laughter echoing through the halls where Catherine's prayers once lived. Anne was unlike any woman Henry had ever known. Sharp as glass, dark as wine. She spoke to him, not as a servant of God, but as a mirror of his ambition. She promised not comfort but legacy, not tenderness but triumph. In her eyes, Henry saw not sin but salvation, the chance to rewrite his destiny and to free his conscience from the chains of Rome. Yet to break his marriage, he had to break the very order of heaven. Mary watched from the margins as the kingdom began to shift beneath her feet. At first, she refused to believe that her father would dare such a thing. But when papal messengers were dismissed, when loyal priests were silenced, when courtiers began to kneel to the king as the new head of the Church of England, she understood that the world she had been raised to defend was collapsing. Her mother's name was struck from every prayer, her coat of arms torn down from every banner, her portraits removed from the palace corridors. Even the coins that bore Catherine's face were melted into new shapes, cold metal erasing warm memory. Henry's defiance grew bolder with every breath of resistance. He thundered that God had punished him for marrying his brother's widow, that the lack of a son was proof of divine displeasure. His court divided like scripture, torn in two, one half bound to Rome, the other to the throne. Mary became a symbol she had never asked to be. To the loyal Catholics of England, she was the true princess, the light of the old faith. To her father, she was the shadow of disobedience, a reminder that not all could be bent to his will. When the decree came in May of 1531, it struck like a curse. Mary was forbidden to see her mother again. The order was simple. They might meet only if both declared their support for the annulment. Catherine refused. Mary refused. The bond between them became an act of rebellion. Letters passed between them like contraband prayers, carried by servants who risked their lives for mercy. Each word was a confession of love, written under the gaze of a furious God. "I will obey only heaven." Catherine wrote, "And you must obey it too." The separation drained Mary of her youth. Her laughter disappeared. She began to wake at night with her heart pounding, her chest tight, her body trembling with the weight of dread. Servants whispered that she was cursed, that she suffered from melancholia. But what she suffered from was grief, the kind of grief that eats through faith until faith itself becomes its own prison. Every sermon she heard about obedience now sounded like a blade pressed against her throat. Henry's court, once the most glittering in Europe, turned into a theatre of fear. Those who hesitated were replaced. Bishops who refused to denounce Rome were imprisoned, some executed. The king's word became law. His desire became doctrine. Anne Boleyn, now radiant with power, began to speak as if she too had been chosen by divine will. She walked the corridors as a queen in waiting, her dark eyes alive with triumph, while Mary's mother wasted away in exile, her body failing under the cold and damp of confinement. When Anne's belly swelled, the kingdom held its breath. Henry boasted that the heavens would finally reward his courage with a son. He ordered banquets prepared, gifts distributed, bells ready to toll for the Prince of England. But on the 7th of September, 1533, when Anne gave birth, the midwives' silence told the truth before the heralds could den. The child was a girl Elizabeth, a healthy, golden-haired daughter, but not the son the king had torn his country apart to receive. Henry's disappointment was sharp and brief. He convinced himself that this daughter was proof of Anne's fertility, that the boy would follow soon after. He refused to see the irony that in his hunger for a male heir, he had fathered the two women who would rule more fiercely than any man of his line. Mary understood it at once. The birth of Elizabeth did not bring her relief but humiliation. Her title as Princess of Wales was stripped from her, her household dismissed, her jewels, her livery, her dignity all taken. And in the cruelest twist of the king's will, she was forced to serve in the household of the infant who had replaced her. Arche day, Mary curtsied before her baby half-sister, performing the gestures of obedience that mocked the truth of her blood. To the courtiers who watched, She was a ghost, haunting her own life. Her pride crushed, her identity unmade. Yet beneath that mask of submission, her mind never stopped burning. She whispered her prayers in secret, clutching her rosary when no one watched, vowing that one day God would restore what man had destroyed. Then came the winter of 1536, and with it, death. Catherine of Aragon breathed her last at Kimbolton Castle. She died as she had lived a queen in all but name. Her last words, a blessing for the husband who had condemned her. Mary was forbidden to attend the funeral, forbidden to weep in public, forbidden even to wear mourning black. When she received the news, she fell to her knees, her hands trembling so violently she could not cross herself. Her mother's body was buried without honour, her grave unmarked by the crown she had worn. But across England, thousands of candles were lit in secret. The people still called her the true queen. Henry celebrated the death with feasts and tournaments. The court danced while Mary wept. The contrast was unbearable, the roaring laughter of her father echoing through the same halls where she had once clung to his leg as a child. It was said that he and Anne dressed in yellow, the colour of joy. To Mary, that colour would forever smell of rot. Her isolation deepened. Those who remained loyal to her risked the king's wrath. Her rooms were searched for forbidden icons, her servants interrogated, her every move reported, yet she endured. Because in her silence, she had discovered a terrible strength, the strength to outlive cruelty. But heaven, it seemed, was not finished rewriting England. Within months, Anne Boleyn herself fell. The woman who had risen on Catherine's ruin now found the same scaffold waiting for her, accused of adultery, witchcraft, and incest. She was tried before a council of men who had once bowed at her feet. Henry did not flinch when the axe fell. He was already courting Jane Seymour, the gentle lady who would bear him the long-awaited son. To Mary, the news brought no joy, only a hollow kind of justice. One more woman had been sacrificed to the same altar of ambition. Yet in Anne's downfall, the wheel of destiny turned again. The new queen, Jane, urged reconciliation, and Henry, weary of rebellion, summoned his daughter back to court. But at a price, she must acknowledge him as head of the Church of England. She must sign the confession that declared her mother's marriage unlawful, herself illegitimate. For days, Mary resisted. She prayed for a sign, for mercy, for thunder to strike before she betrayed her conscience. None came. In the end, terrified and exhausted, she signed. The pen left a smear of ink that looked like blood. The king smiled, content. He believed he had won. Yet even as Mary bent her head, she vowed in her heart that she would never again kneel to any man, only to God. The girl who had once sought her father's approval was gone. In her place stood the woman who would one day claim his throne and baptize his kingdom in fire. And so the divorce between heaven and earth was complete. Henry had broken with Rome, but he had also broken his own blood. And in that fracture, two daughters, one faithful, one watchful, were forged, the child of the forsaken queen and the child of the executed mistress. Two sisters who would inherit the same sin and turn it into destiny. For the realm had lost its soul to a king's desire, but in the shadows of that desire, a new kind of power began to stir quiet, patient, and waiting for its moment to rise. The day Elizabeth was born, the skies over Greenwich were clear and cold, a deceptive stillness settling over a kingdom already bleeding from within. In the great hall, the heralds shouted the news of a healthy princess, and bells pealed from the towers in reluctant joy. Courtiers smiled because it was required Yet the smiles faltered at the edges. They had waited for a prince, for the long-promised son, who would heal the wound between crown and heaven. And instead, another daughter had come into the world. But Henry VIII, defiant and flushed with pride, refused to read disappointment in the silence of his courtiers. He declared that his newborn Elizabeth would be the jewel of a new age, the living proof that his union with Anne Boleyn was blessed. The streets were draped in crimson banners, the fountains ran with wine, and prayers were offered for the child who would, by her very existence, divide England's soul even further. Mary received the news not as a sister, but as a sentence. The letter that once would have borne her title now called her Lady Mary, a stranger in her own lineage. The baby whose birth was celebrated in golden letters had erased her from the line of succession, had turned her into an orphan of law, while her father still lived. She was ordered to leave her own household and take up service in that of the infant Elizabeth, to bow before the cradle that had stolen her birthright. Each morning she curtsied before the swaddled child, her face composed into the serenity of obedience, while something deep within her splintered into silence. In the quiet hours, when the palace slept, she would trace her mother's rosary beads, whispering Ave Maria beneath her breath, knowing that every prayer was an act of defiance against her father's church. Anne Boleyn, crowned in triumph, moved through the court like a comet. She believed herself untouchable, chosen, destined to give England a dynasty. She wore her power as she once wore her laughter, bright, sharp, and dangerous. Yet already the court that had cheered her rise was sharpening its knives. The same men who had urged the king to defy Rome now watched her with calculation, waiting for the first tremor of weakness. For Henry's passion was a weather that changed without warning. His desire, once a flame that had consumed a kingdom, began to cool in the shadow of unrealized dreams. The birth of a daughter, the slow passing of years without a son, the whispers that Anne's pride had become arrogance, all these began to poison his thoughts. Mary watched it unfold with the stillness of a survivor. She knew the rhythm of her father's heart: adoration, disappointment, fury, abandonment. She had lived it before, and so she recognized the beginning of Anne's fall, long before Anne herself could sense it. The Queen's laughter grew louder, almost dispirited. Her gestures more lavish, her words edged with panic. She quarreled with the king in public, defied his temper, and courtiers began to turn their eyes away when she entered a room. A court built on fear requires silence. Those who speak too boldly remind the tyrant of his conscience. In the spring of 1536, the gossip became prophecy. The Queen had miscarried again, a son this time, lost in blood and despair. Henry's grief turned instantly to rage. He stormed from the chamber, muttering that God had denied him once more, that perhaps the union he had risked his soul to defend was cursed after all. For the first time, Anne saw in his eyes not love, but the cold, impersonal cruelty he reserved for those he no longer needed. The courtiers who had once flattered her began to avoid her gaze. Even her enemies spoke her name in past tense. Mary felt no triumph in it, only a heavy inevitability. She understood better than anyone that Henry's affection was the most dangerous gift a woman could receive. And yet, as rumours spread that the Queen had been unfaithful, that she had betrayed the sacred body of the king, with musicians and noblemen, something in Mary recoiled. She despised Anne. Yes, but she despised injustice more. The charges, whispered in candlelit corridors, bore the scent of convenience. Anne was guilty not of adultery but of exhaustion. She had failed to give the king a son. The trial was a pageant of doom. The accused were brought to the Tower, including Anne's own brother, condemned before a verdict was ever written. Henry, now devoted to Jane Seymour, his gentle new fascination, did not attend. The Queen stood before her judges in a gown of black satin, her composure a kind of martyrdom. When the sentence was read, she did not cry. "I am clear from all offence towards the king," she said softly, "and I pray God save him." On the morning of her execution, she knelt upon the scaffold, the wind lifting her hair as if the heavens themselves hesitated to witness what man had done. The French swordsman struck once, and the woman who had changed the course of Christendom became another ghost in the king's long procession of regrets. Mary heard the toll of the bell and bowed her head, not in rejoicing but in grim understanding. The wheel had turned again. The woman who had taken her mother's place now lay headless, and another pale, quiet Jane Seymour would take Anne's. Yet Mary did not mistake divine justice for peace. The blood that fed her father's kingdom was the same blood that ran in her veins. Each death brought her closer to the crown, but also deeper into the labyrinth of guilt that was the Tudor inheritance. Jane Seymour's first act as queen was an attempt at reconciliation. She spoke gently of Mary to the king, pleading that a daughter's obedience should not condemn her forever. Henry, perhaps softened by the prospect of yet another chance at a son, agreed to pardon her on conditions. Mary must sign a declaration recognizing him as supreme head of the Church of England, admitting that her mother's marriage had been unlawful, confessing that she herself was illegitimate. The document was placed before her like a blade. For days she resisted. Her confessor begged her to yield, reminding her that defiance could end on the scaffold. But every word of the oath felt like betrayal of her mother, of her faith, of the very ground she stood upon. She wrote and rewrote her reply until ink blotted the page like tears. At last, trembling and feverish, she signed. The pen shook in her hand. A single drop of ink fell beside her name, dark and round as a wound. Henry smiled when he received it, believing the matter closed. He welcomed Mary back to court, greeted her with a kiss before the watching courtiers, as if love could be conjured from obedience. To the world, it seemed a reconciliation, but in the stillness of her chamber that night, Mary pressed her hand over her heart and knew she had sold a part of her soul to survive. The ink on that confession would never dry. Soon after, Jane Seymour bore the long-awaited son, Edward, and died in childbirth. The court mourned her with a sincerity it had not shown for years. Henry, at last a father to a prince, seemed both vindicated and diminished, a man who had won everything and lost everything at once. Mary and Elizabeth stood together at the christening, two half-sisters, bound not by affection, but by the gravity of shared silence. For both knew that beneath the hymns and the incense lay the bones of the women who had come before them. And so the cycle continued: desire, betrayal, birth, death. The English court had become a stage upon which the same tragedy played endlessly, only the faces changing. Mary watched, learned, and waited. She had signed her father's lies to stay alive, but within her burned the quiet certainty that truth, like faith, cannot be killed. Elizabeth, the child of the executed queen, was growing fast, bright, curious, wary. She was her father's daughter in mind and manner, and something in her gaze reminded Mary of every wound she had ever endured. Yet there was also pity, unspoken and real. Between them, neither knew it yet, but they would become the two halves of England's soul, the flame of vengeance and the mirror of reason, each destined to rule, each destined to break in her own way. In those final years of Henry's life, as the king grew heavy and haunted, Mary moved quietly through the court, her presence a shadow he no longer dared confront. Elizabeth watched from afar, Learning that silence could be sharper than accusation, the ghosts of their mothers lingered between them, whispering of crowns bought with blood. By the time the old king finally succumbed, the kingdom he left behind was no longer whole. The line of succession was written in doubt, the faith of England divided, and the hearts of his daughters scarred beyond healing. Yet in that ruin, two seeds had taken root, the will of Mary and the cunning of Elizabeth. From their father's chaos, they would forge two reigns that would define eternity. And so, on that cold January night when the bells of Westminster tolled for Henry VIII, the world did not yet know that the truest heirs to his empire were not his sons, but his daughters, one born of the forsaken queen, the other of the condemned. The age of men had ended in silence. The age of the sisters was about to begin. When Henry VIII finally closed his eyes, England did not exhale in peace. It merely changed the rhythm of its fear. The kingdom had been a body held together by the force of one man's will, and when that will dissolved into death, the bones of faith, loyalty, and lineage began to creak. In the cold corridors of Whitehall, candles flickered beside the dying king's body while his courtiers whispered of succession. His long-awaited son, Edward, barely 9 years old, would inherit the crown. A fragile boy born from a mother who had died, giving him life. He was the last pure symbol of his father's obsession, the male heir who had cost England its soul. Mary and Elizabeth stood apart at the funeral procession, two daughters watching the coffin of the man who had both created and destroyed them. Mary's eyes, dark and steady, betrayed no tears. She had cried enough for one lifetime. Elizabeth, younger and sharper, hid behind the stillness she had learned from years of observation. Around them, the nobility murmured prayers for the departed king, but in their hearts they were already calculating power, sensing that under a boy's rule, ambition could speak again. The Reformation had torn the country in half, and now the crown rested upon a child's brow light enough to carry, easy enough to bend. Edward VI was proclaimed king beneath a sky of cold silver light. Trumpets blared, church bells clanged, and across London the people cheered, though many did not know for what. They hoped for stability, but they were about to inherit another storm. The new monarch's body was small, his voice still unbroken, yet his mind, sharpened by tutors loyal to the Protestant cause, had already been filled with certainty. He believed himself chosen by God to cleanse England of the old faith. To finish the work his father had begun with violence and pride. Around him gathered men of ambition, men who whispered counsel in his ear and ruled in his name. Among them, one figure towered: Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the boy's uncle, who called himself protector of the realm. Somerset's rule was a strange mixture of vision and vanity. He reformed laws, expanded charity, but pushed the kingdom further toward Protestantism, stripping churches of their images, tearing down relics, silencing priests who clung to Latin prayers. To the young king, this was holy progress. To Mary, it was desecration. She lived now in quiet exile on her estates, where the rhythm of her days was marked by the sound of forbidden mass echoing from secret chapels. Her household clung fiercely to the old religion, whispering the name of Christ in the tongue Rome had given them. Her faith was no longer a private devotion, it was resistance. Letters from court reached her, like thorns wrapped in parchment. The council demanded that she abandon her practices, that she use the English prayer book instead of the Latin missal. Mary refused. She reminded them that she was her father's daughter, a princess, by birth if not by title, and that no man born of ambition could command her conscience. Each refusal tightened the noose of suspicion around her. Spies reported every visitor, every priest, every sermon whispered in her hall, yet she would not yield. In her defiance, she began to resemble her mother more than ever proud, patient, and unbreakable. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was being shaped in a different crucible. The teenage princess had been placed in the household of Catherine Parr, her father's last wife, whose intelligence and charm had once softened the old king's final years. After Henry's death, Catherine remarried Thomas Seymour, the ambitious brother of the Protector. Their house was filled with tension, political intrigue, disguised as domestic warmth. Seymour, reckless and hungry for power, began to treat the young Elizabeth with a familiarity that was both dangerous and confusing. He would enter her chamber unannounced, tease her, hold her too long when he spoke. Elizabeth, clever but still a child, tried to laugh it away. But Catherine saw what was happening and sent her from the house. The scandal spread like smoke. To the court, it was an episode best buried. To Elizabeth, it was a lesson written in fire that power and desire are twins, and both demand vigilance. Back in London, the boy king's government continued to strip the land of its sacred past. The monasteries that had survived Henry's fury were dissolved, their stones sold, their treasures melted into coin. The relics of saints were tossed into the Thames. The bones of ancient kings were disturbed, their tombs desecrated in the name of reform. For many, it felt as though England itself had been excommunicated. Famine followed, rebellion simmered, and faith, whether old or new, began to taste of fear. Mary wrote to her brother, pleading that he temper his zeal, reminding him that peace could not be built upon the ashes of conscience. But Edward, young and convinced of his divine mission, replied, not as a sibling, but as a sovereign. "You will conform," he said, "for I am your king." Their correspondence turned into accusation, then silence. The bond between them, once fragile but real, broke under the weight of ideology. Where once Henry had torn apart church and family for a woman, now his children were tearing each other apart for heaven. The year 1553 brought the final reckoning. Edward's health, always delicate, began to fail. His body, thin and fevered, betrayed the strength of his conviction. Physicians bled him, prayed over him, fed him potions of mercury and gold, but the disease devoured him slowly, relentlessly. As his lungs filled and his skin grew pale, the council grew desperate. They knew that by law, his half-sister Mary was next in line to inherit, and they knew that if she ascended the throne, the Protestant dream would drown in holy water. In the fevered quiet of his last months, Edward was persuaded, or perhaps convinced himself, to alter the succession. He wrote a new decree, a fragile document born of panic and persuasion, naming Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, as his heir. Jane was gentle, learned, and most importantly, Protestant. She would preserve what he had built. Mary and Elizabeth were both written out of history. Once again, Edward died on a summer evening, the 6th of July. He was 15. The court shrouded his death in secrecy for days, afraid that Mary would raise her banners before they could secure the throne for Jane. But word travels faster than loyalty. When Mary heard the news, she did not weep. She stood by the window of her manor in East Anglia, the wind lifting her veil, and whispered a single prayer: "God has given me this moment." Within hours, she began to gather her supporters. The country, weary of experiment and betrayal, rallied to her name. Peasants, soldiers, nobles, even those who had feared her faith now saw in her the blood of the true line. In London, Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. The trumpets sounded, but the people did not cheer. The streets were silent. The churches uneasy. The shadow of Mary loomed too large. Within 9 days, the council that had placed the crown on Jane's head would tear it away again. The tide of allegiance turned with astonishing speed, washing away the careful plans of men who had forgotten that faith and blood, once awakened, move like fire through dry fields. Mary rode toward London in triumph, her banner embroidered with the cross of Christ, her heart ablaze with the conviction that she was God's instrument. Elizabeth rode to meet her, 1,000 horsemen behind, cloaked in green and white. The colours of the Tudors, together. They entered the city as the bells roared and the people wept. To the watching crowds, it was the return of the rightful queen. But beneath that roar of celebration, another truth trembled. The sisters who smiled to the crowd were already destined to face each other as rivals. Edward's death had not ended the war of faith. It had only passed the torch from a boy's fragile hands into the grip of a woman whose heart had been forged in humiliation and flame. The battle that began in their father's bed would now be fought in the soul of England itself. And as the torches flickered over London that night, Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, heir to the old faith, the forsaken child of Henry VIII, was no longer merely her father's daughter. She was the beginning of something new and something terrible. When the wind from East Anglia swept toward London that summer, it carried with it not only the dust of armies, but the breath of prophecy. Mary Tudor was riding to reclaim what had been taken from her, a crown denied, a mother avenged, a faith resurrected from ashes. The roads trembled with the weight of hooves and the murmur of prayers. Peasants left their fields to kneel as she passed. Priests emerged from hidden chapels to bless her banners, and bells rang from church towers that had long been silent under Protestant rule. In her crimson cloak, with the crucifix of her mother's Spain gleaming at her throat, Mary seemed less a woman than an omen. The daughter once called illegitimate was now the rightful queen. And England, weary from years of false kings and broken faith, bowed its head to her. Yet her victory was not born of vengeance alone. In her heart there burned a conviction that this triumph was not hers, but God's, that heaven itself had restored her to heal the wound her father had carved across the soul of the realm. The court that had conspired against her now flooded to her side, their loyalty as convenient as ever. Nobles who had hailed Lady Jane Grey as queen just days before now threw themselves at Mary's feet, offering contrition wrapped in gold. She received them with the calm of one who had learned how quickly love in England could turn to treachery. When she entered the city, the air was thick with incense, the cheers of the people blending with the sound of hymns. Elizabeth rode beside her, graceful and watchful, the embodiment of youth beside the gravity of destiny. The people saw two Tudor daughters united. They did not yet see the shadow forming between them. In Westminster, the great crown of state was placed upon Mary's head. The coronation was drenched in symbolism, Latin liturgy, the sign of the cross restored, choirs, echoing words that had been forbidden for 2 decades. It was not merely the crowning of a queen, it was the resurrection of an old world. The woman once mocked as her father's mistake now held the scepter as both monarch and messenger of divine correction. To her, the message was clear: England must return to the true faith, and she was the instrument chosen to guide it back. But beneath the hymns and the organ music, another sound whispered the rustle of unease among those who had prospered under the new order. Mary's first acts as queen were not of cruelty, but of reconciliation. She pardoned those who had opposed her, including the trembling Lady Jane Grey, whose innocence she pitied even as she recognized the danger of her name. Yet mercy has a short lifespan in the corridors of power. The council, fearful that Jane's existence might continue to inspire rebellion, demanded her death. Mary hesitated, her heart torn between compassion and necessity. In the end, she signed the warrant with a hand that did not tremble. But her eyes were hollow when the axe fell. The price of stability, she told herself, is always paid in blood. Her next decision would define her reign. To secure her position and strengthen England's bond with Catholic Europe, she announced her intention to marry Prince Philip of Spain, the heir to the most powerful empire in Christendom. To Mary, it was a sacred alliance, a marriage of faiths as much as of hearts. But to her people, it was the whisper of subjugation. England had fought too long to free itself from the grip of foreign crowns, and now their queen, barely seated upon her throne, was offering herself to one. Parliament murmured, the streets filled with seditious pamphlets, and even Elizabeth's silence began to feel like defiance. Still, Mary pressed on. When Philip arrived in England, he came not as a lover, but as a diplomat. Tall, grave, distant, he was a man bred for duty rather than affection. Their wedding at Winchester Cathedral in the summer of 1554 was grand, but cold, a ceremony of politics wrapped in the language of love. As the Latin vows echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling, Mary looked into his eyes and saw not passion, but patience. Not desire, but diplomacy. Yet in her heart she believed that God had blessed this union, that through it England would return to the fold of Rome and the Tudor line would be secured by the child she hoped to bear. Her optimism was short-lived. No sooner had the wedding bells faded than rebellion rose again. Across the country, Protestant factions whispered of betrayal, of Spanish domination, of the Queen's supposed plan to deliver England into foreign hands. The discontent found its leader in Sir Thomas Wyatt, who marched toward London with thousands of men, shouting Elizabeth's name as the rightful heir. It was a rebellion of faith disguised as patriotism, and it struck directly at Mary's heart, not only because it threatened her crown, but because it forced her to face the truth. She had long denied that her sister's existence was both her blood and her curse. When Wyatt's forces reached the city gates, Mary climbed to the balcony of the Guildhall to face her people. The wind tangled her hair. The sky above her, the color of steel. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, resonant, filled with the authority of one who believed her mission divine. I am your queen, she said, the daughter of Henry VIII, and I will die among you if it must be so. The courage in her tone broke the tide of rebellion. The people rallied. The insurrection crumbled. Wyatt was captured, and the conspirators dragged to execution. But in the ashes of that failed revolt, suspicion was born. Suspicion that pointed directly toward Elizabeth. Mary could not ignore it. Her council insisted that her half-sister had known, had encouraged the plot, had dreamt of the crown. Whether true or not, the danger was undeniable. Elizabeth was summoned to court, questioned, denied, then imprisoned within the cold stones of the Tower of London. There, in the same chambers where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had once awaited death, she now sat alone, staring at the cracks in the walls, feeling history breathe down her neck. The ravens outside cried as if they remembered. For Mary, it was the cruelest paradox. She had spent her youth imprisoned by her father's will, separated from her mother, branded illegitimate. Now she found herself repeating his sins, wielding power with the same ruthless necessity that had once destroyed her family. Each decision seemed righteous in the moment and monstrous in memory. She prayed nightly for forgiveness, yet each dawn demanded new severity. The rebellion had shaken her faith in mercy. If England was to be saved, she told herself, then sin must be burned from it. And so began the great purges, the trials, the pyres, the flames that history would name her by. But at the beginning of that long descent, there was still the faint echo of tenderness. She spared Elizabeth's life, refusing to sign the death warrant placed before her, perhaps out of sisterly mercy, perhaps out of fear that another execution might turn the tide of fortune against her. When Elizabeth was finally released, she bowed low and spoke carefully measured words of loyalty. Yet both women knew that between them now lay a gulf that could never again be crossed. Mary's faith had been hardened by loss, her love poisoned by betrayal. She had risen to the throne as the saviour of England, and already she could feel it slipping through her fingers. But in her own heart she believed that every cruelty she committed was a form of penance, that she was burning away her father's sins and her own weakness in the same fire. To her, suffering was salvation. To the world, it was terror. And thus the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the child who had once wept alone for her mother, became the queen who would make an empire tremble. Each act of defiance she had once endured, she now mirrored upon her enemies. Each humiliation she had once swallowed, she now forced her realm to taste. Her reign was the echo of her own childhood, the same pain, the same devotion, only reversed. The people who had cheered her entry into London now whispered behind their shutters. The bells that had rung for her coronation began to toll for her victims, but Mary did not hear them as condemnation. To her, each burning was a hymn, each execution a prayer, and as she walked through her palaces, the crucifix heavy against her chest, she believed that even the smoke that darkened her skies was a sign of heaven's favour. For in the fragile heart of a woman once denied everything, power and piety had become indistinguishable. Mary Tudor no longer ruled as her father's daughter, nor as her husband's queen. She ruled as the wrath of God made flesh, the flame that would purify a kingdom, even if it consumed her, along with it. The fires began quietly. A single torch lifted in the courtyard of Smithfield. A single name called into the winter air. A single body tied to the stake. But as the flames rose, so did Mary's conviction that she was cleansing England of heresy, that each spark was a prayer ascending to heaven. In the beginning, she told herself it would take only a few examples to restore obedience. Yet faith is not conquered by fear, and the more she burned, the more resistance glowed beneath the ashes. The realm that had hailed her as deliverer now whispered her new name in secret, Bloody Mary, a title forged not from malice, but from the terrible symmetry of her belief. For Mary did not burn out of cruelty. She burned out of certainty. London in those years was a city of divided souls. Church bells rang for Mass again. But in hidden rooms, English Bibles were read by candlelight. Soldiers marched in processions carrying relics of saints once smashed by reformers, while just across the river, the apprentices of the city sang psalms in defiance. The air itself seemed torn between two worlds, the incense of Rome and the smoke of rebellion. Mary would walk through the galleries of Whitehall, rosary clutched in her fingers, whispering to her ladies that she could still smell the sin of disbelief, that the stench of her father's apostasy lingered in the very stones. And when she dreamed, she saw her mother's face lit by firelight, urging her on, telling her that salvation was never gentle, that heaven required the suffering of earth. Her husband, Philip, meanwhile, was little more than a shadow. When he had first arrived, she had seen him as God's chosen partner, the one who would restore England's place among the faithful nations. But after a year, he was already restless, called back to his father's empire, leaving Mary with a court that loathed the Spanish presence and a heart that refused to stop yearning. She sent him letters heavy with longing, waiting for an answer that seldom came. At night, she would pace her chamber, staring at the crucifix above her bed, asking whether loneliness was the test of divine love or the punishment of mortal pride. Then came the miracle. She thought would silence every doubt she was with child. The court erupted in celebration. Bells rang. Bonfires flared. Sermons declared that God had rewarded her virtue. Elizabeth was summoned from the country to attend her sister in the coming birth. The Queen's belly swelled. Her cheeks flushed with joy. And she began to prepare the cradle for the heir who would secure her throne and extinguish the last embers of rebellion. For months, she spoke of nothing else. Her faith renewed, her spirit almost radiant. Yet as spring turned to summer, the palace fell into an unnatural quiet. Days passed, weeks passed, and the Queen did not go into labor. Physicians whispered, midwives frowned. The swelling remained, but there was no child, only a slow, suffocating dread that crept through the corridors like a ghost. At last, the truth could no longer be hidden. There was no child. What Mary carried was not life, but the cruel shadow of her own hope, a phantom pregnancy, perhaps the cruel trick of her body, perhaps the echo of some deeper illness. She locked herself away for days, refusing to eat, refusing to speak. The bells that had rung for joy now tolled like funeral knells. Philip, restless and embarrassed, departed again for Spain, and this time the silence between them became permanent. In the eyes of her subjects, the false pregnancy was more than tragedy. It was omen. They whispered that God had withdrawn his favor, that the Queen who had promised redemption was cursed with barrenness. From that moment, Mary began to change. The softness that had once flickered through her piety hardened into steel. She no longer sought to persuade. She sought to purify. The burnings multiplied bishops, scholars, women, even children accused of heresy were brought to the stake. The pyres blazed not only in London but across the shires Oxford, Canterbury, Gloucester, each one, a small sun consuming its own believers. Mary would not attend the executions, but she would pray during them, kneeling in her private chapel, tears streaming down her face as she whispered that their suffering was necessary, that only through fire could England be reborn. Elizabeth, free now from the Tower, yet watched by spies, observed all this with the silence of survival. She kept her words measured, her gestuures obedient, her mind hidden behind a veil of calm. But within, she was already learning how to rule not with faith or fury, but with the subtle power of perception. She understood that Mary's reign was built upon fear, and fear, though mighty, consumes itself. The more the Queen tried to cleanse her kingdom, the more the people began to recoil. They did not see salvation, they saw smoke. Mary's body, too, was betraying her. The phantom pregnancy had not been an isolated cruelty. Her health faltered. She suffered fevers, swelling, and the same mysterious pains that had plagued her mother. The court doctors whispered of cancer, though none dared speak it aloud. She would walk through the gardens of St. Lemma, James's palace, leaning heavily on her attendants, her eyes hollow, her lips murmuring prayers for a miracle that never came. She missed her husband, but even more, she missed the certainty of purpose that had once carried her. Doubt, once unthinkable, began to seep into her soul, yet she refused to name it doubt. She called it temptation, the devil's whisper against her sacred duty. Outside her walls, the kingdom she had tried to save was unraveling again. Famine spread, harvests failed, trade faltered, and the Spanish alliance dragged England into foreign wars that drained both coin and blood. When news reached her that Calais, England's last possession in France, had been lost, She collapsed in grief. When I die, she is said to have whispered, "They will find Calais written on my heart." In that lament was the echo of everything she had lost: love, legacy, and the illusion that God's will and her own were one. Elizabeth was summoned again to court. Her presence a reminder of continuity that comforted the restless nobles. She came with practiced grace, her head bowed, her eyes downcast, speaking with tenderness, offering loyalty without warmth. Mary saw through it, she always had. Yet there was something in her sister's composure that disarmed her, something she both envied and feared. In Elizabeth's stillness, Mary glimpsed a strength that did not come from faith, but from understanding. And for a fleeting moment, she wondered whether she had been wrong to fight the world, instead of learning how to bend it. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, drowned by confession and the rhythm of the rosary. By the autumn of 1558, the Queen could no longer rise from her bed. The courtiers whispered outside her chamber, the fire in the hearth burning low. The priests prayed at her side, their voices trembling with the weight of expectation. She was 42, the same age her mother had been when the crown was taken from her. In her final days, Mary asked to see the crucifix of gold that had once belonged to Catherine of Aragon. She pressed it to her lips, murmuring a prayer for her husband, for her sister, for her people, though perhaps only heaven knew which she meant to forgive and which to curse. When the end came, it was quiet, no thunder, no proclamation, only the sigh of a woman who had carried too many ghosts. Elizabeth was ready. She had been waiting all her life for that silence. When the bells of London began to toll again, they no longer mourned fire, but heralded dawn. The new Queen stepped into the sunlight of history, her sister's smoke still curling in the air. To some, she was deliverance. To others, deception. But she knew, as she walked through the echoing corridors Mary had left behind, that she owed her reign to the very flames that had consumed it. Mary's legacy did not end with her ashes. It lived in the lesson she left behind, that power rooted in fear cannot last, and that faith without mercy becomes its own heresy. Yet even in her failure, she had given England something it had never known before, the sight of a woman ruling by her own conviction. And though history would crown her sister with glory, it was Mary who had first broken the gate. And so the Queen who had burned for God became the ember from which another kind of light would rise, not the light of heaven, but the light of endurance, the quiet, unyielding glow of survival. The fire had not destroyed England, it had tempered it, and as Elizabeth took her place upon the throne, she carried within her the echo of that fire, the reminder that all crowns are forged in flame, and that no queen, however wise, ever rules without the shadow of her sister at her back. When the fire went out, the silence it left behind was heavier than smoke. England exhaled at last, its sky grey with the ghosts of prayers turned to ash. In the dying embers of Mary's reign, faith had become exhaustion, and the Queen herself had become its reflection, a body burning inward, while the world she sought to save slipped further from her grasp. Those who dared to enter her presence now found her rooms dim and airless, the windows shrouded to keep out the damp, the Queen's figure thin and restless beneath layers of brocade. She was not yet old, but her spirit had aged beyond measure. The hope that once crowned her face had fallen away, leaving only devotion brittle, unwavering, and almost beautiful in its ruin. They called her Your Majesty, yet few truly believed she still ruled. Her husband had returned to Spain. His absence was more painful than any rebellion. Philip's portrait hung above her writing desk, a calm, distant face surrounded by gold leaf, but it might as well have been a gravestone. She wrote to him still, long letters of loyalty and longing, each one sealed with trembling hands and sent across a sea that no longer answered. He had his empire, vast and sunlit, stretching across continents. She had her island cold, divided, muttering against her. Love, which she had imagined as a bridge between them, had become the moat that kept her forever alone. It was in that solitude that her mind began to wander between visions of divine purpose and flashes of doubt she could not admit even to herself. At times, she would wake before dawn, convinced she heard her mother's voice calling her to prayer. At others, she would weep without reason, whispering that England was unworthy of her sacrifice. When courtiers came to speak of trade or war, she listened with the distracted patience of one who had already crossed into another world. They saw in her eyes the reflection of a dying fire, something that could still burn but no longer warm. The phantom child had broken her. That cruel trick of the body, that hollow swelling of hope, had left a deeper scar than any loss of battle or faith. She had believed so utterly that God had rewarded her, had dreamed of holding a son who would bind her people together, that when no child came, something inside her collapsed. She began to doubt not the church, not even heaven, but herself. Her priests told her it was a test, that great saints had endured illusions of grace before receiving true reward. But her heart could no longer trust such comforts. Her faith remained intact, but it had lost its music. It no longer sang, it merely endured. The realm mirrored her despair. The people starved, the fields failed, the rain fell without mercy. Spanish troops bled England's coffers dry, and war devoured what piety had not. In the taverns, men spoke her name in curses. In the markets they whispered of a curse upon the land. Even the nobles, those masters of swift allegiance, began to glance toward Hatfield, where Elizabeth waited pale, composed, and gathering quiet loyalty like mist. The two sisters met once more in those waning months, in a palace that smelled faintly of wax and death. Mary received Elizabeth with the dignity of habit, her posture regal, though her hands trembled as she held the crucifix that had once belonged to their mother. "You have been patient," she said softly. Elizabeth bowed, her voice smooth, her expression unreadable, only as befits my sister and queen. For a moment, they studied one another, two faces carved from the same bloodline, divided by the same curse. Mary saw in Elizabeth what she herself had lost: youth without fear, beauty without shame, belief without suffering. It was not jealousy that stirred in her then, but recognition. She knew that her time had ended, and that Elizabeth's had already begun. Outside, the world shifted once again. The new Pope in Rome, Paul IV, had turned against Spain, branding Philip an enemy of the Church. Mary, who had spent her reign trying to reconcile England to the papacy, found herself trapped between two masters, a husband she loved who no longer wanted her, and a church she worshipped that no longer wanted him. It was an irony too sharp even for her to bear. For the first time, her prayers faltered. When the priests spoke of God's plan, she smiled faintly and said nothing. Her body began to betray her more openly. The swelling returned, not of pregnancy but of sickness. Her stomach hardened, her breath shortened, her nights filled with pain. She could not name. The doctors bled her, fed her powders of silver and herbs from Spain. Yet nothing eased the decay. Some whispered that she was being punished for the deaths of the innocent. Others murmured that she was suffering for the sins of her father. She herself believed both. In her fevered hours, she would speak of fire, of how it once illuminated the darkness, and how now it only consumed. Perhaps, she whispered one night to her confessor, I mistook wrath for love." He crossed himself and begged her not to speak such words again, but she did not retract them. As her strength failed, she withdrew from ceremony. The grand processions ceased. The court dimmed its colours. Laughter became an act of treason. She would sit for hours by the window, her gaze fixed on the grey river, murmuring the rosary in Spanish as though she could call back her mother from the sea. Sometimes, she would ask the musicians to play the old hymns of her childhood songs that had once filled the chapel of Greenwich when she was still the golden child of a hopeful king. When the last note faded, she would sigh and say that the sound reminded her of wind through ruined cathedrals. Philip returned briefly in those final months, a formality of duty rather than affection. He came not to comfort her but to discuss alliances, treaties, and wars. When he entered her chamber, she struggled to rise. Whispering his name, he kissed her hand with the politeness of a stranger. They spoke for an hour, perhaps two, before he departed again. As his ship left the harbour, Mary stood at the window, watching the sails vanish into the mist, her fingers pressed against the cold glass. Those who saw her said she did not move for a long time after. By the time autumn came, the physicians knew she would not last. The fever had deepened. Her body swollen. Her skin paler als wax. The court waited outside her chamber, restless as wolves scenting change. Elizabeth, now favoured by the nobles, received visitors quietly, saying little but understanding everything. When news reached her that her sister could no longer speak, she crossed herself and walked into the garden, where the leaves fell like silent confessions. On the morning of the 17th of November, 1558, the Queen's confessor found her still. The crucifix lay in her hands, the gold worn smooth, where her thumb had rubbed it through years of desperate faith. Her last words, they said, were for her mother, and for God, though perhaps they were for herself. "Into thy hands," she murmured, "for there is nothing left of mine." When the bells tolled that day, England did not mourn, as it once had. The people heard in their sound not tragedy but release. The smoke had cleared. The sky was pale again, and the name that once frightened them was now simply history. The courtiers bowed to the new dawn, and Elizabeth stepped forward, her face composed, her heart steady, her voice calm, as she accepted the weight of a nation's expectation. "The past is finished," she said, though she knew it never truly would be, and so the reign of Mary I ended not with fire but with silence. The Queen who had sought to purify her kingdom through suffering had instead purified herself through failure. Yet even in that failure there was a strange, enduring grace. For though history would remember her as a tyrant, she had given her sister the path. She could never find the vision of rule, not through fear, but through understanding. In the stillness of Westminster Abbey, where the two sisters would one day lie side by side, the story of their blood was already complete. One had burned for heaven, the other would shine like the sun. Between them stretched the narrow road. Every ruler must walk between love and power, between faith and mercy, between fire and light. And in that space, where the echoes of their voices lingered like prayer, England was born anew. The morning Mary's heart went still. The sun rose pale and hesitant, as though uncertain whether it should dare to shine on a kingdom so drenched in memory. England had lived for years in the shadow of fire, its churches still smelling faintly of smoke, its people carrying scars that no decree could erase. But now, as the bells of Westminster tolled once more, the air itself seemed to change. The old Queen's breath had vanished into silence, and in that silence stood her sister Elizabeth, slender and grave, wrapped in black velvet, her face unreadable beneath the veil. She did not weep. She did not smile. She simply listened to the tolling of her sister's passing as though it were the heartbeat of destiny resuming its rhythm. When the courtiers approached her, bowing low and murmuring the ritual words of allegiance, she raised her head and spoke softly. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." In that single sentence, England felt the turning of an age. The reign of fear was ending, but the ghosts that had built it still lingered. Elizabeth knew it well. She had survived the tower, survived suspicion, survived the endless balancing act between faith and her own survival. Now the crown that had killed her mother and broken her sister would rest upon her own head, and the weight of it would never truly lessen. The first days of her rule were days of watching and waiting. The people, uncertain, gathered in the streets to see her face. They expected sternness. Perhaps another monarch cloaked in divine wrath. What they saw instead was a woman who smiled, not out of mirth but out of quiet control. She was not her sister. She was not her father. She was something England had never seen before. A monarch who ruled not through fear but through presence, who wielded silence as others wielded swords. Her first acts were measured, deliberate, almost gentle. The burning ceased. The prisons opened. The realm, starved of laughter, began to breathe again. Yet peace was not a gift, but a performance. Elizabeth understood that mercy, in politics, was another form of strategy. She restored the Protestant faith. Yes, but carefully, not as her father had with rage, nor as her brother had with arrogance, nor as her sister had with fire. Instead, she did it through ritual, through symbols so subtle that both sides of the divide could claim victory. The old churches were stripped of their saints, yet candles still burned upon the altars. Latin gave way to English, but the hymns still soared with the same aching beauty. In her realm, ambiguity became art. Still, the past refused to vanish. At night, in the echoing chambers of Whitehall, Elizabeth would sometimes wake from dreams of her sister's voice calling her name, half accusation, half blessing. She could not forget the tower, nor the cold stone floors where she had once knelt praying for her life while Mary debated her death. And though she ruled now in triumph, she knew her power existed only because her sister had burned herself away to make room for it. The ghost of Mary was not an enemy in Elizabeth's memory. It was a mirror, a reminder of how thin the line was between faith and fanaticism, between devotion and destruction. As the years turned, her reign began to take shape like a tapestry of contradictions. She was loved and feared, adored and doubted. Ambassadors from across Europe came to her court, bearing gifts and marriage proposals. For a queen without a husband was an anomaly in a world still ruled by men. Yet each offer she refused. Some said it was pride. Others called it caution. But perhaps it was something deeper, an understanding that marriage for a woman in her position was not love, but surrender. She had seen too much of what kings did to their wives, what men did to power. Her father had devoured queens. Her sister had been devoured by the man she worshipped. Elizabeth would not feed the pattern again. Instead, she crafted a myth, the Virgin Queen, married not to any mortal man, but to England itself. It was both armor and illusion. She allowed her courtiers to adore her, to speak of her as divine, untouchable, almost holy. But beneath the gold and ceremony, she remained keenly human. She laughed often, though never too loudly. She listened more than she spoke, and she ruled with the patience of someone who knew that the crown was a game of endurance. Her court became a theatre of light poets, philosophers, musicians, explorers, all orbiting her brilliance, all feeding the image of a golden age. And yet, Even as she built that splendor, the shadows never quite disappeared. The flames her sister had kindled still burned in memory, and the scars they left were not so easily healed. The Protestants who adored Elizabeth often forgot that she had once survived by pretending to be Catholic. The Catholics who hated her never forgave her for wearing the mask too well. Rebellion flared. Plots festered. And through it all, Elizabeth moved like a dancer across a stage of knives. She played Spain and France against each other, spoke to both sides of her divided nation, and somehow, for decades, balanced the impossible. But every balance comes at a cost. There were nights, those closest to her would later whisper, when the Queen would walk alone through the corridors of Hampton Court, stopping before the portraits of her family. She would pause before her father's, his face stern and magnificent, and whisper, "I have done what you could not." Before her mother's, she would whisper nothing, only bow her head. But when she came to Mary's portrait, the one the court painters had almost refused to hang, she would linger longest. "You showed them that a woman could wear the crown," she would murmur, "and I showed them how to keep it." Sometimes she would reach out her hand as if to touch her sister's face, her fingers trembling just above the painted cheek. And for a heartbeat, it seemed the two queens might forgive each other through time. Unter Herein, England changed its shape. Ships sailed beyond the known world, bearing her name, like a charm against death. The arts flourished. The language itself seemed to awaken. Yet even in the glow of prosperity, Elizabeth carried the solitude of her inheritance. The more power she held, the lonelier she became. Love came and went suitors, favourites, the reckless charm of Robert Dudley, but she let none claim her heart. She had learned that intimacy, like power, demanded surrender. And surrender was the one thing she could never again afford. Years turned into decades. Her hair, once red as autumn, turned to pale gold. Her hands, once steady, trembled with age. But she held the image she had built, the Virgin Queen, the eternal flame, until it became her armor and her curse. When she looked into the mirror, she saw not the girl who had trembled in the tower, but a reflection shaped by centuries of struggle, her father's ambition, her mother's defiance, her sister's faith, all fused into the still, inscrutable face of the last Tudor. On the last night of her life, as she lay in the quiet chamber of Richmond Palace, she asked that no candles be lit. She wanted only the faint glow of the moon through the window, the same light that had fallen over her sister's deathbed years before. Around her stood the portraits of her lineage ghosts in oil and silence. "We are all one," she whispered, her breath barely audible. "One blood, one fire, one end." When dawn came, she was gone. The Virgin Queen had become a legend, and the Tudor line with her. The courtiers wept, but the kingdom did not crumble. England had learned to stand without its kings, and that was her final gift. Later, when they placed her beside Mary in the tomb at Westminster Abbey, the inscription was chosen with delicate irony: "Partners in throne and grave. Here we rest together." And so they do. Two sisters divided by faith yet united by destiny. One ruled by flame, the other by light. One sought salvation, the other sought understanding. Between them lies the story of a nation's awakening, a kingdom born from the war between love and power, faith and freedom, heaven and earth. And if you stand today in the hush of that great abbey and listen closely, you might still hear them. Two voices intertwined beneath the stone, one whispering in prayer, the other in reason. Together they tell the same truth in different tongues, that every crown is both a burden and a blessing, and that even the fiercest fire, once it burns itself to ash, can become the light that guides the world.